They dumped snow on my lawn for 3 winters straight, and for a long time I told myself it was just one of those neighborly misunderstandings you shrug off because you don't want to be that guy. The guy who makes everything a problem. The guy who measures property lines with a tape measure and a grudge. I wasn't that guy. At least, not in the beginning. I live in a small town outside Cedar Brook, the kind of place where people still wave from their trucks and the hardware store sells coffee that tastes like it's been sitting there since 1987. My house sits right up against a shopping plaza called Brookside Commons. It's not glamorous. There's a grocery store, a nail salon, a pizza joint that's actually pretty decent, and a big asphalt parking lot that stretches all the way to my back fence. When I bought the place, I liked that it backed up to something commercial. No neighbors peeking over the fence, no barking dogs at midnight. Just a wide open strip of grass that rolled down from my yard to the tree line separating me from the plaza. Quiet enough. The first time it happened, I didn't even get mad. We'd had one of those heavy January snowfalls, thick wet snow that sticks to everything. I woke up, poured my coffee, looked out the back window, and there it was. A long ridge of snow piled right along the edge of my lawn. Maybe 3 feet high, 4 feet wide. It looked like someone had taken a giant icing spatula and scraped the entire parking lot clean, then pushed the leftovers onto my grass. I remember standing there thinking, well, they probably don't know where the line is. The plaza had just hired a new snow removal company. I'd seen the trucks. Bright red plows, loud diesel engines. Guys who looked like they were racing each other instead of clearing snow. I figured they were new, didn't know the boundary, honest mistake. So I let it go. Then it happened again. Next snowfall, same thing. The entire back edge of the lot cleared straight into my yard. And then again. By the third storm, that little ridge had turned into a frozen wall. Snow mixed with road salt, gravel, bits of trash that had been hiding in the lot all year. I found cigarette butts frozen in the ice. A cracked plastic cup. One time, I swear, there was a single sneaker sticking out of the pile like some kind of suburban fossil. By mid-January, my backyard didn't look like a yard anymore. It looked like the aftermath of a minor avalanche. And here's the thing about snow mixed with salt. It doesn't just melt. It lingers. It seeps. It kills whatever it touches. When the sun hit it during the day and it refroze at night, it turned into this dense, dirty crust that just sat there, suffocating the grass underneath. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked out that window, it felt personal. Not because of the snow itself, but because nobody had asked. Nobody had knocked on my door and said, "Hey, do you mind if we push a little overflow onto your lawn?" It was just assumed, like my property was an extension of theirs. After the fourth storm, I called the plaza management office. A woman answered, cheerful, rehearsed. I explained the situation. She transferred me. Then I got transferred again. Finally, I ended up talking to a guy named Mark Ellison. He introduced himself as the operations manager for Brookside Commons. He sounded tired, like I wasn't the first call he'd taken that day. "Snow's being pushed onto your lawn," he said. "Yes," I said. Repeatedly. "Probably just a boundary issue," he replied. "We'll look into it." That was it. No apology. No urgency. Just we'll look into it. Next snowfall, they did it again. That's when I called back. This time Mark sounded less patient. "Sir, the plow company is under contract. They're instructed to clear the lot efficiently." Efficient for who? I asked. There was a pause on the other end. "If you believe they're crossing property lines," he said carefully, "you'll need to take that up with them." So I did. I tracked down the name of the snow removal company. Ridgeway Property Services. I called their office. A man with a gravelly voice picked up. "They're dumping snow on my property," I told him. "We follow the lot lines provided to us," he said flatly. "They're wrong." "Prove it." That was the first time I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly. More like challenge. Prove it. Up until that moment, I'd still been operating under the assumption that this was a misunderstanding. That once someone realized the mistake, it would get corrected. But the tone in his voice told me something else. They weren't confused. They were confident. That night I dug through the folder of documents from when I bought the house. I found the original plat map. Faded lines, measurements scribbled in tiny print. It was hard to read, and I'll be honest, I'm not a surveyor. But even squinting at it under my kitchen light, something looked off. The parking lot seemed close. Closer than I remembered. I called a licensed surveyor the next morning. It cost me $800 I hadn't planned on spending. At the time, that felt ridiculous. All over a few piles of snow. But something in me needed to know. When the survey crew came out, they were methodical. Little orange flags, metal stakes, measuring equipment that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. I stood in the yard with my hands in my pockets, watching them work, trying not to feel foolish. 2 days later, the surveyor called. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you might want to come take a look at this." I walked the back edge of my property with him that afternoon. He pointed to a line of stakes running parallel to the shopping plaza's parking lot. "This," he said, tapping one with his boot, "is your property line." I looked from the stake to the asphalt. The asphalt didn't stop at the stake. It crossed it, by 6 feet. Not in one small section, not just a corner. The entire back edge of Brookside Commons parking lot extended roughly 6 feet into my land. Dumpster enclosure, loading zone, at least a dozen parking spaces. All of it. I felt this strange mix of vindication and disbelief. For years, maybe longer than I'd even lived there, that plaza had been operating partially on land that wasn't theirs. And they had the nerve to tell me to prove it. Standing there, looking at those orange flags cutting through their pavement, I realized something simple. This was never about snow. And for the first time, I stopped feeling like the unreasonable neighbor. I started feeling like the owner. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry. Not even because I was excited. It was something else, that quiet hum you get when you realize the ground beneath your feet is not what you thought it was. For 3 winters I had stared out that back window thinking I was on the defensive, that I was the small guy asking for basic courtesy. And now I had a row of orange survey flags telling me the truth was bigger than snow. 6 feet. 6 feet across the entire back edge of their lot. That's not a mistake. That's not a plow driver drifting off course. That's design. That's construction plans. That's concrete poured and lines painted and dumpsters placed with intention. I walked the property again the next morning. The snow was still there, crusted gray and hard, but now I could see it differently. The mound they'd been pushing onto my grass wasn't even technically necessary. They already had my land. They just took more because it was convenient. Convenience. That word kept echoing in my head. It was convenient for them to assume the previous homeowner didn't care. Convenient to treat that strip like a buffer zone. Convenient to run a business without paying for every inch they used. I called an attorney that afternoon. A local guy named Daniel Reeves. Mid-50s, calm voice, reputation for being thorough without being flashy. We met in his office, which smelled faintly like old paper and peppermint tea. I laid everything out. The snow, the calls, the survey. He studied the plat map and the survey results for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, almost amused, "you don't just have a snow problem." "No," I said. "I guess I don't." He explained something called adverse possession. If someone uses land openly and continuously for a certain number of years without the owner objecting, they can sometimes claim legal ownership of it. It varies by state, he said. It's complicated. Courts don't love it, but it exists. "How long have they been using that strip?" he asked. 15 years, maybe more. The previous owner was there a long time. He nodded slowly. "Then we need to know whether they had permission." That word again. Permission. I went home and called Margaret Holloway, the daughter of the man who owned my house before me. I'd met her briefly at the estate sale when I bought the place. She was kind, a little overwhelmed at the time. She remembered me. "Oh, the house by the plaza," she said. "Dad always liked that yard." I explained the situation carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. I asked whether her father had ever allowed the shopping center to use part of the property. There was a long pause. "Well," she said slowly, "about 12 years ago they were doing construction. Expanding the loading area. I remember Dad complaining about the noise. I think he let them use a little strip temporarily so trucks could maneuver while they repaved." "Temporarily?" I asked. "Yes." He said it was just until they finished. He didn't want to fight with them. She offered to look through her father's old files. A week later, she emailed me scanned notes. Handwritten. Dated. A brief agreement referencing temporary access during construction. Nothing formal, but clear enough. Temporary. That was all Daniel needed. He drafted a letter to Brookside Commons ownership group. Not to Mark, not to the management office, but to the actual holding company that owned the property. In it, he enclosed the survey and demanded that all structures encroaching on my land be removed within 30 days. We sent it certified. The response came from their legal team 10 days later. I remember opening that envelope at my kitchen counter, sunlight cutting across the paper. Their attorney argued that the plaza had maintained open, continuous, and notorious use of the strip for over a decade, that they had improved it, paved it, maintained it, that under state law, they had grounds to claim adverse possession. Reading it, I almost laughed. They were trying to take it. Daniel didn't laugh. He just said, "This is posturing." We responded with copies of Margaret's documentation and a clear statement. Permission, even informal, defeats adverse possession. You can't claim land you were allowed to use temporarily. 2 weeks passed. No removal. No construction crews. No calls. Instead, another letter arrived. This one less aggressive. They offered to purchase the 6-foot strip. The number was almost insulting. Low 5 figures. It wouldn't have covered the long-term value of the land, let alone the frustration. Daniel looked at me across his desk. "You don't have to sell," he said. I thought about it. I really did. Part of me wanted the easy resolution. Take the check. Let them keep their pavement. Move on with my life. But every time I pictured that snow wall creeping onto my yard year after year, every time I remembered being told to prove it, something hardened inside me. I declined. They increased the offer. Still not close to what it was worth, especially given the leverage I now understood I had. Without that strip, they'd lose parking spaces. They'd lose part of their loading zone. The dumpster enclosure might not even comply with code. I declined again. That's when winter started to loosen its grip. The snow began to melt. And what it left behind was worse than I'd imagined. My lawn looked like it had survived a small war. The grass along the back edge was brown and dead. Deep ruts carved into the soil from where plows had pushed and compacted the snow. Patches of gravel embedded in the dirt. It wasn't cosmetic. It was damage. I stood out there one afternoon, mud soaking into my boots, and felt something settle. Up until then, this had been mostly paperwork. Letters, surveys, negotiations. Now I could see the physical cost of letting things slide. I called a fencing company. Not a wooden privacy fence. Not decorative. Chain link. Installed exactly on the surveyed property line. Stake to stake. The owner of the fencing company came out to measure. He raised an eyebrow when he saw the orange flags cutting into the parking lot. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said. Installation day felt almost cinematic. The crew showed up early. Post holes drilled. Concrete poured. Metal posts rising in a straight, uncompromising line. As the fence took shape, it sliced cleanly through asphalt that had been painted with parking lines for years. By mid-afternoon, 12 parking spaces were unusable. Half of their loading zone was pinched down to something barely functional. The dumpster enclosure, once easily accessible, now had a fence line inches from its gates. I stood in my yard watching it all, feeling strangely calm. My phone rang less than an hour later. Mark. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "It's my property line," I said evenly. "You can't just block off access like that. Businesses rely on those spaces. Businesses rely on land they own," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "You're being unreasonable." I looked at the fence, sunlight glinting off the metal. "For 3 winters," I said, "your contractors dumped snow on my lawn. I called. I asked politely. Nothing changed. Now I've enforced my boundary. That's not unreasonable." "It was the plow company," he snapped. "You hired them." Silence. Then the line went dead. I expected retaliation. Angry emails. Maybe even someone trying to tamper with the fence. Instead, 2 days later, I received a different call. A woman introduced herself as Laura Whitman. She said she represented the ownership group directly. Her voice was calm, controlled, professional in a way that told me she handled problems for a living. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we'd like to resolve this amicably." For the first time since that first snow pile, I felt the shift. The power dynamic had changed, and they knew it. When Laura called, she didn't sound angry. She sounded careful. "That's how you know something matters." "Mr. Carter," she said, measured and polite, "we believe this situation has escalated further than anyone intended. We'd like to find a solution that works for both parties." I leaned back in my kitchen chair, looking out the window at the fence cutting across what used to be 12 bright white parking lines. "For 3 years," I said, "I tried to solve it." "I understand that," she replied smoothly. "And I apologize for how your concerns were handled." That was the first apology anyone from that plaza had offered. It didn't erase anything, but it registered. We agreed to meet in person the following afternoon. She showed up in a dark SUV, stepped out in a tailored coat, the kind of person who doesn't raise their voice because they don't have to. There's authority in restraint. We stood near the fence line, the cold air still carrying that late winter bite. She looked at the posts set clean into concrete, then at the asphalt abruptly ending against metal mesh. "This creates operational challenges," she said carefully. "I imagine it does." She didn't smile, but her eyes flickered, like she recognized I wasn't bluffing. "Here's what we're prepared to offer," she continued. "We'd like to secure a formal easement for that 6-foot strip. 10 years. In exchange, we'll fully restore your lawn. Topsoil, sod, grading, irrigation if necessary. We'll also compensate you financially." "Define compensate," I said. $15,000. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it felt like muscle memory. Another low offer wrapped in politeness. "I'm not selling it," I said. "Not selling," she corrected. "Granting access. Same difference if it's underpriced." She didn't argue. She just nodded once, like she expected resistance. 30,000, she said after a moment. I shook my head. The thing is, by then it wasn't about squeezing every dollar out of them. It was about principle. For years, that strip of land had been invisible to everyone but me. It was treated like overflow space, like dead space, like it didn't matter. Now it mattered. We went back and forth for over a week. Emails, drafts, revised language, my attorney flagging clauses, their legal team tightening phrasing. It was professional, almost surgical. No raised voices, no threats, just leverage. Meanwhile, the fence stayed exactly where it was. I could see the impact. Delivery trucks awkwardly angling into the narrowed loading zone. Customers circling for parking. Employees glancing at the fence like it was a permanent reminder of a miscalculation. At one point, I ran into a manager from the grocery store while grabbing milk. He looked at me, then said quietly, "You're the fence guy, right?" "Guess so." He didn't look mad. He looked impressed. "Took guts," he said. Maybe it did. Or maybe it just took finally being tired of being ignored. The final offer came on a Friday afternoon. $50,000 for a 10-year easement. Full lawn restoration to pre-damage condition or better. Irrigation system installed. A 6-foot privacy hedge planted along the fence line once it was moved. All legal fees reimbursed. Survey costs reimbursed. And a new snow removal contract with a strict clause prohibiting any dumping on my property. It was thorough. It was respectful. And it was the first time in the entire ordeal that I felt like they saw me as an equal party instead of an inconvenience. Daniel reviewed the agreement line by line, tightened a few definitions, added penalties for violations. Then he looked at me. "This is solid," he said. "The question is whether you're ready to close it." I went home and stood in the backyard again. The snow was gone now. The damaged strip of lawn still looked raw, like a scar that hadn't healed. The fence ran straight and unapologetic. I thought about the first pile of snow, how small it seemed, how easy it would have been to keep ignoring it. I thought about the moment that plow company guy said, "Prove it." I thought about how close I'd come to just cashing the first check and walking away. And I realized something. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about drawing a line and meaning it. I signed. A week later, crews arrived. Not plow trucks this time. Landscapers. They scraped away the dead soil, brought in fresh topsoil, laid down thick green sod that smelled like spring. They installed irrigation lines beneath the surface. They planted a row of tall hedges that would, in a year or two, block the view of the parking lot almost completely. It looked better than it ever had. When the fence was moved back 6 feet under the terms of the easement, it no longer felt like surrender. It felt like structure. Defined. Agreed upon. Documented. The parking spaces were repainted. The dumpster enclosure adjusted. Trucks flowed normally again. Laura stopped by one last time to confirm everything was complete. "I'm glad we found a resolution," she said. "So am I," I replied. And I meant it. Because here's the part nobody talks about in stories like this. It would have been easy to villainize them completely. To paint the plaza as greedy, careless, predatory. And sure, there was arrogance in the beginning. There was dismissal. But there was also something else. Assumption. They assumed no one would notice. Assumed no one would push back. Assumed convenience outweighed boundaries. And for a while, they were right. Until they weren't. The following winter, a heavy storm rolled through in early January. I stood at my kitchen window again, coffee in hand, watching the red plow trucks clear the lot. They pushed snow neatly toward the center islands this time, away from the fence, away from my yard. One of the drivers even got out, walked the fence line, and checked the spacing before making another pass. I won't lie, that felt good. Not triumphant, not petty, just respected. Now here's where it gets interesting, and maybe a little controversial. A few neighbors later told me I should have held out longer, that I could have demanded more. Permanent ownership adjustments. 6 figures. Force them to tear up the asphalt completely. Maybe they're right. Legally, I probably had the upper hand. But at some point, you have to decide what you actually want. Did I want revenge? Or did I want acknowledgement and fairness? $50,000 didn't change my life, but it changed the dynamic. It set a precedent. It reminded a multi-tenant commercial property that the quiet homeowner next door isn't invisible. And I'll tell you this, if I had ignored that first pile of snow, none of this would have happened. So I'm curious what you think. Was I right to put up the fence? Should I have pushed harder and forced them to remove everything permanently? At what point does standing your ground become being difficult? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd probably expect. And if you've ever had a neighbor, an HOA, or a business treat your property like it didn't matter, I want to hear that story too. Because sometimes it starts with something small, just a pile of snow. And sometimes that's all it takes to realize exactly where your line is.